The silence in the VIP room was heavier than lead. A single drop of sweat rolled down the restaurant manager's temple as the barrel of a silver pistol tapped rhythmically against the mahogany table. Lorenzo Moretti, the most feared man in the city, wasn't looking for a free meal. He was looking for a traitor, and he was losing patience. The translator was stuttering, the deal was crumbling, and everyone in the room was seconds away from a shallow grave. No one dared to breathe. No one, except the invisible waitress in the corner holding a tray of water. She didn't just drop a glass. She dropped a sentence in a dialect so rare and dangerous that it froze the Mafia boss in his tracks. She was supposed to be serving breadsticks, but she just saved a life and started a war. The Sapphire Lounge was the kind of establishment where the napkins were made of Egyptian cotton and the silence cost more than the steak. It was a place for senators, tech moguls, and people who didn't have job titles, but had very specific instructions on how they liked their meat cooked. For Elena Ellie Vance, it was just a paycheck that barely covered the rent on her studio apartment on the wrong side of the tracks, but a paycheck nonetheless. Ellie was 24, with chestnut hair she kept pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes the color of stormy seas that she kept lowered. That was the first rule of the Sapphire Lounge: be invisible. Table 4 needs sparkling water, Vance, not still. If you mess up the hydration preferences of the senator again, I'll dock your tips for a month. The voice belonged to Marcus Henderson, the floor manager. Henderson was a man who wore suits that were too tight and a cologne that smelled like desperation and pine needles. He treated the staff like indentured servants and the customers like royalty, provided those customers had a net worth of over 10 million. "Yes, Mr. Henderson," Ellie said, her voice soft. She grabbed the crystal bottle from the service bar. "And fix your apron," Henderson snapped, looking at her with disdain. "You look like you just rolled out of a dumpster. Tonight is important. We have the Moretti reservation." The kitchen went quiet. Even the head chef, a man who usually screamed if the risotto was 3 degrees too cool, paused mid-chop. The Moretti family. They weren't just celebrities, they were urban legends. Lorenzo Moretti was the head of a shipping empire that everyone knew moved more than just cargo. He was young for a don, only 32, but he had a reputation for being cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. He had taken over the family business after his father's mysterious death 3 years ago, and since then, the streets had been quieter, but the fear had grown louder. "I thought they usually ate at the grotto," a sous chef whispered. "The grotto burned down last week," another cook muttered darkly. "Accidentally." Ellie felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She adjusted her apron, her fingers trembling slightly. She knew things about men like Moretti, things she tried very hard to forget. "Vance!" Henderson barked. "You're on the private VIP deck tonight. You and Thomas, but mostly Thomas. You are to clear plates and refill water. Do not speak. Do not make eye contact. Do not breathe unless necessary. If Mr. Moretti so much as frowns at you, you're fired. Understood?" "Understood," Ellie said. By 8 p.m., the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The air grew heavy. A line of black SUVs pulled up to the curb outside, blocking traffic. 4 men in dark suits entered first, scanning the room with professional paranoia. They checked the exits, the kitchen, and even the bathroom stalls. Then Lorenzo Moretti walked in. He was undeniably handsome, in a terrifying way. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit that cost more than Ellie would make in 5 years. His hair was black, slicked back, and his eyes were dark, sharp, and devoid of warmth. He didn't walk. He glided, like a predator moving through high grass. Behind him, trailed a nervous-looking man in a cheap grey suit, the translator presumably, and two older Italian men who looked like they had been carved out of granite. Henderson practically bowed as he led them to the VIP deck, a secluded area separated from the main dining room by heavy velvet curtains. "Signore Moretti," Henderson oozed, attempting a bow that looked more like a spasm. "Welcome. It is the highest honor." Lorenzo didn't even look at him. He sat at the head of the table, unbuttoning his jacket. He said something in Italian to the older men. His voice was a low rumble, like thunder in a canyon. The older men laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Water," Lorenzo said in English. It was the only word he spoke to the staff. Ellie moved forward, pouring the sparkling water into the crystal glass near his hand. Her hand was steady, despite the pounding in her chest. As she poured, she caught the scent of him. Expensive leather, cigar smoke, and gun oil. Lorenzo stopped talking. He slowly turned his head, looking at her hand, then up her arm, and finally at her face. Ellie froze. She kept her eyes lowered, focusing on the tablecloth. "Grazie," he murmured, but the tone wasn't thankful. It was testing. Ellie nodded once, backed away, and vanished into the shadows against the wall next to Thomas, the other waiter. Thomas was sweating profusely. "I heard he killed a man with a fountain pen," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Shut up, Thomas," Ellie hissed. "Just do your job." The dinner began, but it wasn't a meal. It was a negotiation. The two older men, evidently partners from Naples, began speaking rapidly in Italian. They were agitated. They kept gesturing at the documents on the table. Lorenzo listened, his face a mask of stone. Occasionally, he would look at the nervous man in the cheap grey suit, the translator provided by the agency. "What are they saying?" Lorenzo asked the translator in English. The translator, whose name was Gary, wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. Mr. Moretti, they say the shipment is late. They are unhappy about the weather in the port." Lorenzo narrowed his eyes. He looked back at the Italians. One of the older men slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. He shouted a rapid string of sentences, spitting on the table in his fury. Ellie, standing 10 feet away in the shadows, felt her blood run cold. She knew exactly what the man had said, and it had nothing to do with the weather. "You think you can fool us, boy? We know you sold the northern route to the Russians. You are a traitor to your father's blood, and tonight you pay the debt." Gary, the translator, looked terrified. "Mr. Moretti, he says the logistics are complicated and they want a higher percentage." Lorenzo looked at Gary. Then he looked at the Italians. He sensed it. He sensed the lie, but he didn't know what the lie was. He reached into his jacket. The air left the room. The security guards by the door tensed up. Lorenzo pulled out a silver lighter, but the motion was aggressive enough that the Italians reached for their waistbands. "Tell them," Lorenzo said softly to Gary, "that I don't negotiate percentages after the deal is signed." Gary turned to the Italians and butchered the translation, using the wrong word for negotiate, which sounded closer to surrender. The older Italian man stood up, his face purple. He reached into his coat. Ellie saw the glint of metal. Henderson, standing near the entrance of the VIP deck, squeaked in terror. "Please, gentlemen, the risotto is coming." No one listened to the manager. The violence was about to erupt. Gary was shaking so hard, he looked like he was having a seizure. Lorenzo looked ready to kill everyone in the room, just to be done with the confusion. Ellie knew she should stay quiet. She knew the rule: be invisible, survive. But if she stayed quiet, Lorenzo Moretti was going to be executed right in front of the appetizer course. The click of a safety being disengaged echoed through the VIP deck. It was a small sound, but in the silence, it sounded like a cannon blast. The older Italian, whose name was Don Antonio, had a snub-nosed revolver half drawn from his jacket. Lorenzo's bodyguards had their hands inside their blazers, ready to draw. It was a Mexican standoff in the middle of a 5-star restaurant. "Signore," Gary the translator squealed. "Please, just more money." Lorenzo ignored Gary. He stared Don Antonio in the eyes. "If you pull that gun, Antonio, your family in Naples will have nowhere to sleep but the sea." Gary didn't translate that. He was hyperventilating. Antonio shouted again, looking at his partner. "Do it now, before his guard moves. Shoot him in the throat." Gary looked at Lorenzo. He says he wants to make a toast. That was it. That was the moment. Lorenzo relaxed his shoulders slightly, thinking the tension was breaking. He took his hand off the lighter. He was lowering his guard. Antonio's finger tightened on the trigger. "He is lying!" The voice rang out, clear, melodic, and sharp. It cut through the tension like a diamond cutter through glass. Every head snapped toward the corner of the room. Ellie had stepped out of the shadows. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. She wasn't looking at the floor anymore. Her stormy grey eyes were locked directly onto Lorenzo Moretti's. Henderson gasped. "Vance! Get back! You are fired! Get out of here!" "He is lying to you, Mr. Moretti," Ellie said, her voice steady, despite the terror gripping her heart. "The translator doesn't know the dialect. He's mistranslating everything." Lorenzo didn't look at Henderson. He didn't look at Antonio. He stared at the waitress in the stained apron. "What did you say?" "The man standing up," Ellie said, pointing a trembling finger at Don Antonio. "He didn't ask for a toast. He told his partner to shoot you in the throat because you lowered your guard. He believes you sold the northern route to the Russians." The silence that followed was absolute. Don Antonio's eyes went wide. He looked at the waitress, shock registering on his face. Lorenzo remained perfectly still, but his eyes shifted to Antonio. "Is that true?" Gary the translator was sobbing now. I don't know that dialect. It's old. It's mountain speak. I learned Italian in a classroom in Ohio." Lorenzo stood up. He didn't look at the translator. He looked at Antonio. "The Russians?" Antonio realized the element of surprise was gone. He ripped the gun from his jacket. "Kill the girl!" Antonio screamed in Italian. But Ellie was already moving. Years of instinct kicked in. Instincts she hadn't used since she was a child. She didn't scream. She didn't cower. She kicked the leg of the heavy oak table near Antonio. It wasn't enough to flip it, but it jarred the table hard enough to knock Antonio's balance. The gun went off. Bang! The bullet shattered a magnum of vintage champagne behind Ellie, spraying glass and foam everywhere. Lorenzo Moretti moved with terrifying speed. In one fluid motion, he grabbed a steak knife from the table and threw it. It wasn't a graceful throw, but it was effective. The heavy silver handle struck Antonio in the temple, dropping him to his knees. Lorenzo's bodyguards lunged across the table, tackling the second Italian man before he could draw his weapon. It was over in 6 seconds. Don Antonio was on the floor, groaning. His partner was pinned. Gary the translator was curled in a fetal position under the dessert cart. Lorenzo stood amidst the chaos, straightening his cuffs. He looked calm, almost bored, except for the fire in his eyes. He walked over to where Antonio was kneeling. "The northern route belongs to me," Lorenzo said quietly, "and I don't sell to Russians." He signaled to his guards. "Take them out the back. Deal with it." The guards dragged the 2 men out. The heavy velvet curtains swayed as they left. Lorenzo turned around. The room was empty of threats now, but full of fear. Henderson was shaking, his face pale as a sheet. "Mr. Moretti," Henderson stammered, stepping forward. "I am so sorry. This incompetence, this waitress, she disturbed your meeting. I will have her arrested. I will ensure she never works in this city again." Lorenzo held up one hand. Henderson shut his mouth instantly. The Mafia boss walked past the manager as if he didn't exist. He walked straight to Ellie. Ellie was pressed against the wall, glass shards in her hair, champagne soaking the shoulder of her uniform. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving. She expected him to be angry. She expected a bullet. She had intervened in family business. That was a death sentence. Lorenzo stopped 12 inches from her. He towered over her. Up close, his eyes were an intense, piercing blue that she hadn't noticed before. "You speak Sicilian," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ellie whispered. "Not just Sicilian," he corrected, tilting his head. You understood the Camorra slang he used. Mountain speak, as the idiot under the table called it. Where did a waitress at the Sapphire Lounge learn the dialect of the Naples Old Guard? Ellie swallowed hard. I watched a lot of movies. Lorenzo's lips twitched. It was almost a smile, but sharper. "Movies?" "Yes, sir." "You saved my life," Lorenzo said softly. "I didn't want blood on the carpet," Ellie deflected, looking down. "Mr. Henderson hates stains." Lorenzo let out a short, dry laugh. He turned to Henderson, who looked like he was about to faint. "Manager!" Lorenzo barked. Yes, Mr. Moretti." "This woman is fired," Lorenzo said. Ellie's heart dropped. After everything, she was still losing her job. She looked up, tears stinging her eyes. "Please, I need this job." "You're fired," Lorenzo repeated, his eyes locked on hers. "Because you're hired by me." Henderson blinked. "Excuse me." "She is coming with me," Lorenzo said, extending a hand toward Ellie. It was a demand, not an offer. "I have a business merger next week in Rome, and apparently good help is hard to find. Get your coat, Miss Vance." "I can't," Ellie said, backing away. Panic flared in her chest. If she went with him, if she entered his world, her cover would be blown. The past she was running from would find her. "I really can't." Lorenzo stepped closer, invading her personal space. His voice dropped to a whisper, intimate and threatening. "You understood, Antonio, which means you know who I am, and more importantly, you know what I am. You just witnessed an attempted hit on a Don." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her face. "You think I'm going to let you walk out of here and disappear? You're a witness, and now you're my responsibility." "Is that a job offer or a kidnapping?" Ellie asked, her chin lifting defiantly. Lorenzo smirked. "Let's call it an internship. Get your coat." Ellie looked at Henderson, who was nodding frantically for her to obey. She looked at the door, where the bodyguards were waiting. She had no choice. She untied her apron and let it drop to the floor. "Fine," she said. But as she walked out of the Sapphire Lounge, flanked by the most dangerous men in the city, Ellie knew one thing for sure. Lorenzo Moretti thought he had found a useful translator. He had no idea he had just invited the daughter of his family's greatest enemy into his home. The waitress was a lie. The real Elena was far more dangerous than the men with the guns. The ride in the back of Lorenzo Moretti's armored Maybach was suffocatingly silent. The city lights of Chicago blurred past the tinted windows, replacing the familiar grimy streets of Ellie's neighborhood with the wide, tree-lined avenues of the wealthy suburbs. Ellie sat rigidly against the plush leather interior, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her, Lorenzo watched her, with the unsettling intensity of a hawk, studying a field mouse. He hadn't spoken since they left the restaurant. He didn't need to. His presence filled the car, a cocktail of raw power and lethal calm. In the front seat sat the driver, a mountain of a man whose neck was wider than Ellie's waist, and next to him was Marco, Lorenzo's second-in-command. Marco had wire-frame glasses and the cold, efficient demeanor of an accountant who solved problems with spreadsheets and silencers. He had spent the entire ride glaring at Ellie in the rearview mirror. "The dialect," Lorenzo said suddenly, his voice cutting through the hum of the engine. "Where specifically did you hear it? Which village?" Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew this interrogation was coming. "I don't remember the name of the village in the movie. It was an old film. Neo-realism." Lorenzo leaned forward slightly. The scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and something metallic, washed over her. "You lie with the ease of a politician, Ms. Vance. But politicians usually have better cover stories. That dialect hasn't been spoken in cinema since the 50s, and the slang Antonio used, the mountain speak, that is only spoken by families who trace their blood back to the original clans of Corleone." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. "My grandmother was from Sicily," Ellie lied, offering a sliver of truth to coat the deception. "She lived with us when I was young. She had dementia. Sometimes she forgot English and would only speak in her native tongue to me." Lorenzo studied her face, searching for micro-expressions of deceit. Ellie held his gaze, using every ounce of willpower she possessed to keep her face neutral. It was a skill she had learned very young, the mask of indifference. "A grandmother with dementia taught you the specific vocabulary used to order an assassination," Lorenzo mused dryly. "She must have been a fascinating woman." "She was very protective," Ellie retorted. The car slowed and turned through monumental wrought-iron gates emblazoned with a stylized M. They drove up a winding driveway lined with ancient oaks until the estate came into view. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress disguised as a Tuscan villa planted in the middle of Illinois. It was sprawling, illuminated by architectural lighting that made the stone facade glow golden against the night sky. "Welcome home," Lorenzo said, the words dripping with irony. They pulled under a porte-cochere. Marco opened the door for Lorenzo, then jerked Ellie's door open with unnecessary force. "Watch your step, signorina," Marco spat, his Italian accent thick and menacing. He clearly viewed her as a security risk that should have been neutralized in the alley behind the Sapphire Lounge. Lorenzo led them inside. The foyer was cavernous, featuring a double staircase of white marble and a chandelier that looked like it belonged in Versailles. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly cold. It felt like a mausoleum for the living. "Marco will show you to your quarters," Lorenzo said, checking his gold watch. "You will find suitable clothing in the closet. Burn that apron. Tomorrow morning, at 8 a.m. sharp, you will be in my study. We have a conference call with Rome to clean up the mess you helped prevent tonight." He started to walk away toward a set of mahogany double doors, then stopped and turned back without looking at her. "And Elena?" She froze at the use of her full name. She hadn't told him that. "Don't try to leave the grounds. The perimeter is monitored by thermal cameras, motion sensors, and dogs that are trained not to bark before they bite. You are my guest. Try to escape, and you become a trespasser. We treat trespassers very poorly." He disappeared into his study. Marco grabbed Ellie's upper arm, his grip like an iron cuff. "This way, waitress." He practically dragged her up the marble stairs and down a long gallery hallway, lined with oil portraits of severe-looking men. Lorenzo's ancestors, no doubt. A lineage of violence, framed in gilded wood. Marco shoved her into a room at the end of the hall. "The boss is making a mistake," Marco hissed, leaning close enough that she could smell the espresso on his breath. "You are a loose end. If you slip up, even once, I won't wait for his permission to tie it off." He slammed the door, and she heard the distinct click of a heavy lock sliding into place from the outside. Ellie was alone. She looked around the room. It was larger than her entire apartment. It had a 4-poster, king-sized bed, a fireplace, and French doors that led to a small balcony overlooking the dark grounds. The closet was filled with designer clothes, blouses, tailored trousers, cashmere sweaters, all in her size. He had investigated her. He knew her size, her full name. How much else did he know? Ellie walked to the mirror above the antique dresser. She looked at her reflection. The pale face, the grey eyes that had seen too much. She pulled the pins out of her hair, letting the chestnut waves fall around her shoulders. She wasn't Ellie Vance, the waitress, anymore. She was back in the world she had run from 10 years ago. She reached under her uniform blouse to the small silver locket she always wore. She clicked it open. Inside was a tiny, faded photo of a man with laughing eyes and a strong jaw, holding a little girl on his shoulders. "I'm inside, Papa," she whispered to the photo. "I found the man who killed you." The tear that rolled down her cheek wasn't from fear. It was from a cold, burning hatred that had fueled her for a decade. Lorenzo Moretti thought he had captured a useful bird. He didn't realize he had just locked himself in a cage with a viper. The next morning, the air in Lorenzo's study was thick enough to choke on. The room smelled of old books, expensive leather, and stale cigar smoke. Lorenzo sat behind a massive desk that looked like it had been carved from the hull of a sunken galleon. Ellie sat in a stiff-backed chair opposite him, wearing a silk navy blouse and grey trousers she'd found in the closet. They fit perfectly, which unnerved her more than if they hadn't. On the desk, a high-tech speakerphone with encrypted lines was blinking red. "The situation has become complicated," Lorenzo said, his eyes scanning a briefing document. "Word of Antonio's failure traveled fast. Now the Russians are nervous. They think I'm weak because I didn't kill Antonio on the spot. They think my hold on the northern route is slipping." He looked up at Ellie. "You are going to help me convince them otherwise. The man on the other end of this call will be Sergei Volkov. He heads the Chicago arm of the Bratva. He speaks English, but he prefers to negotiate in his own language when he wants to hide his true intent. He's bringing his own translator, but I need to know what they are saying to each other between the official statements." "I don't speak Russian," Ellie said quickly. Lorenzo threw a manila folder across the desk. It slid to a stop in front of her. "Open it." Ellie hesitated, then opened the folder. It contained her employment file from the restaurant, a copy of her lease, and her community college transcripts, and then a page highlighted in yellow, language electives, advanced Russian literature, 4 semesters, grade A. Ellie's mouth went dry. "That was years ago. I barely remember the alphabet." "Another lie," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "My sources tell me your mother was Ukrainian. You grew up hearing Slavic tongues just as much as English. Stop playing games, Elena. We are past that." Ellie stared at the paper. He was peeling back her layers faster than she could reinforce them. Yes, her mother was Ukrainian. A beautiful, sad woman who drank herself to death after Ellie's father disappeared. "If I mess this up," Ellie said quietly, "what happens? Then Sergei Volkov will declare war on the Moretti family by lunchtime, and since you are now part of my household, you will be on the front lines." He pressed a button on the console. "Connecting now. Do not speak unless I tell you to. Just listen. Take notes on the pad provided." The line clicked and hissed. A deep, gravelly voice spoke in heavily accented English. "Lorenzo, I hear your dinner party had fireworks last night." Minor indigestion, Sergei, Lorenzo replied smoothly, leaning back in his chair. Antonio is old. He gets confused. Confusion is dangerous in our line of work, Sergei rumbled. There was a pause, and then Sergei spoke rapidly in Russian to someone in the background. Tell the arrogant Italian prick that if his southern partners are revolting, our agreement for the docks is null and void. We don't partner with sinking ships. Lorenzo looked at Ellie. She kept her face blank, scribbling on the notepad. Sergei's translator, a younger male voice, came on the line. Mr. Volkov expresses concern over the stability of your coalition in Naples. He wishes to pause the dock agreement until things settle. Lorenzo muted the phone. Well? Let the games begin. Ellie looked at her notes. The translator softened it. Volkov called you an arrogant Italian prick. He said your partners are revolting and you are a sinking ship. The agreement is null and void, not just paused. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. A vein throbbed in his temple. Good. He unmuted the phone. Sergei, Lorenzo said, his voice colder than zero. Tell me, when did the Bratva start getting frightened by old men shouting in restaurants? I control the docks. I control the unions. If you walk away, my price goes up 20% tomorrow for whoever takes your place. Perhaps the Albanians are looking for an opportunity. Silence on the line. Then, more rapid Russian from Sergei to his associates. He's bluffing about the Albanians, but he's right about the unions. We need that access for the shipment next week. We have to smooth this over, but don't let him think he won. Demand a gesture of good faith. Ask for the warehouse in Cicero as collateral. The translator came back on. Mr. Volkov insists that our partnership is strong. However, given the recent instability, he requires a temporary token of assurance. He suggests you transfer the deed to the Cicero warehouse to us, just until the northern route shipment clears. Lorenzo muted the phone again. He looked ready to agree. The Cicero warehouse was valuable, but expendable to keep the peace. Don't do it, Ellie said sharply. Lorenzo's eyes snapped to hers. Excuse me. He's not scared of the instability, Ellie said quickly, realizing she was overstepping, but unable to stop. He knows you control the unions. He needs you for next week's shipment. The demand for the warehouse isn't for assurance. It's a land grab. They know something about that location that you don't. Lorenzo stared at her. What could they know? It's empty space. Then why did Volkov just say to his advisor, make sure we get the basement access confirmed before we sign? Ellie lied. Volkov hadn't said that. But she knew how these men thought. If they wanted something small, it was because it hid something big. Lorenzo processed this. He didn't know if she was telling the truth, but the risk was too high. He unmuted the phone. Sergei, no warehouse. You have my word as a Moretti. That is all the assurance you get. If that's not enough, the Albanians get the call in 5 minutes. The silence dragged on for an agonizing 10 seconds. Ellie held her breath. If Volkov called the bluff, chaos would erupt. Finally, Sergei's booming laugh echoed through the speaker. You Italians, always so dramatic. Fine, Lorenzo. We proceed as planned, but keep your house in order. The line went dead. Lorenzo stared at the phone for a long moment, then slowly turned his gaze to Ellie. The look he gave her was terrifying. It was a mixture of fury, respect, and deep, unsettling curiosity. You lied to me just now, Lorenzo said quietly. Ellie froze. What? Volkov never mentioned a basement. I speak enough rudimentary Russian to catch nouns. I know the word for basement. He didn't say it. Ellie met his gaze, refusing to back down. No, he didn't. But he wanted that warehouse too badly. If I hadn't invented a reason for you to say no, You would have given away a strategic asset for nothing. I saved you from being robbed." Lorenzo stood up slowly and walked around the desk. He stopped inches from her chair, placing his hands on the armrests, trapping her. "You are a very dangerous creature, Elena," he murmured, his face close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You manipulate men like pieces on a chessboard. First Antonio, now Volkov. And you tried to manipulate me." "I was doing my job," she whispered, her heart pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "Your job is to translate words, not invent strategy," he said, his voice rough. He leaned closer, his dark eyes boring into hers. The air between them crackled with sudden, shocking electricity. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was an undeniable, primal awareness of each other. He reached out, his fingers grazing her jawline. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence latent in his body. "Who taught you to think like a consigliere?" he asked softly. Was it the grandmother with dementia? Or was it someone else? Someone who knew this life? Ellie couldn't breathe. He was too close to the truth. Before she could answer, the heavy oak door burst open. Marco stood there, looking flustered, holding a tablet. "Boss, we have a problem at the docks. The feds are—" Marco stopped dead, taking in the scene, his boss leaning over the waitress, his hand on her face, the intense intimacy of the moment. Lorenzo didn't immediately pull away. He let his hand linger for a second longer on Ellie's jaw, before slowly straightening up and turning to Marco. His expression was ice-cold again. "What is it, Marco?" Marco glared at Ellie with pure venom before addressing Lorenzo. "Customs is doing a surprise inspection on Pier 4. Right now." Lorenzo swore under his breath. "Get the car. Elena, come with us." "Why her?" Marco protested. "Because," Lorenzo said, grabbing his suit jacket, "if the feds have a translator, I need one who lies better than theirs." The situation at Pier 4 was chaos controlled by bureaucracy. Floodlights illuminated the towering stacks of shipping containers against the oily black water of Lake Michigan. Dozens of customs and border protection agents in windbreakers were swarming around a specific container, while a nervous-looking harbor master tried to explain something to a stern female agent holding a clipboard. Lorenzo's motorcade rolled up, the presence of the black SUVs immediately changing the dynamic on the dock. Agents put their hands near their holsters. Lorenzo stepped out, looking immaculate and untroubled, as if he were attending an opera rather than a potential federal indictment. Ellie was instructed to stay by the car with Marco, who was practically vibrating with hostility. "Don't get comfortable, waitress," Marco muttered, cleaning his fingernails with a small knife. "Boss might be amused by your parlor tricks right now, but when the novelty wears off, you're just another liability." "You're just mad because he listened to me instead of you," Ellie retorted quietly, watching Lorenzo charm the lead federal agent. Marco stopped cleaning his nails and pointed the knife at her. "I know what you are. You're a plant, a honey trap set by the Giordanos or the Russians, and I'm going to prove it." The mention of the Giordanos sent a shard of ice through Ellie's heart. The Giordano family, her father's employers, the rivals the Morettis had spent decades trying to crush. Lorenzo walked back toward them, looking annoyed, but not worried. "It's fine. Just a routine shake-up. They're fishing based on an anonymous tip. They won't find anything in that container except Italian marble tiles." He looked at Ellie. "You did well to stay quiet. Sometimes silence is the best translation. Let's get out of here before they decide to check the VIN numbers on the cars," Marco grumbled. They drove back to the estate in silence. The adrenaline of the day was starting to fade, leaving Ellie exhausted and raw. She had survived 24 hours in the lion's den. She had lied to a Russian mobster and manipulated a Mafia don. She was playing a game with stakes so high that vertigo spun in her head. Back at the mansion, Lorenzo bypassed his study and headed for a large set of double doors Ellie hadn't noticed before. "Come," he ordered her. It was a music room. A grand piano sat in one corner, and the walls were lined with glass display cases containing antique firearms, flintlock pistols, engraved revolvers, weapons that were works of art. Lorenzo walked to a wet bar in the corner and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He handed one to Ellie. "Scotch, 25 years old. Drink. It will settle your nerves." Ellie took the heavy crystal glass. She didn't drink, but she held it. Lorenzo took a sip of his, watching her over the rim of the glass. The intensity from the study had returned, but it was different now. Less aggressive, more contemplative. He walked over to one of the display cases. Inside rested a pair of gleaming, silver-plated Colt 1911s with pearl grips. They were magnificent and deadly. "My father's favorites," Lorenzo said quietly. He believed that violence should always be administered with style. Ellie looked at the guns. A memory flashed in her mind, bright, painful, and sharp. A kitchen table covered in newspaper. The smell of gun oil. Her father, laughing, showing a 10-year-old girl how to break down a similar pistol. "See, Elena, it's like a puzzle. If you respect the pieces, they work for you. If you fear them, they jam." She must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, because Lorenzo turned to look at her. "You like them?" he asked. "They're efficient," she managed to say. Lorenzo put his drink down and unlocked the case. He took one of the silver pistols out, checking the chamber with practiced ease. He held it out to her, handle first. "Hold it." Ellie stared at the weapon. "I don't like guns." "Another lie," Lorenzo said softly. "I watched you at the restaurant. When Antonio went for his piece, you didn't scream. You didn't cover your head. You assessed the threat, you saw the line of fire, and you kicked the table to disrupt his aim. Those are not the reflexes of someone who dislikes guns. Those are the reflexes of someone trained to be around them." He pressed the gun into her reluctant palm. "Take it. Feel the weight." Ellie's fingers closed around the pearl grip. It felt cold, heavy, and terrifyingly familiar. Her muscle memory tried to take over, her index finger instinctively seeking the trigger guard, her thumb brushing the safety. She forced her hand to remain limp, feigning awkwardness. Lorenzo watched her hand closely. He noticed the slight twitch of her thumb. "Who was he, Elena?" Lorenzo asked, his voice dropping to a hushed whisper that echoed in the large room. "Who was who?" Ellie looked up, her eyes wide. "The man who taught you about honor among thieves. The man who taught you Sicilian mountain dialects and Russian insults. The man who taught you how to hold a 1911. He stepped closer, taking the gun from her hand and placing it back in the case. He didn't move away. He stood directly in front of her, his presence overwhelming. "You are not a waitress," he said, stating it as a fact. "You are a soldier hiding in an apron. I've seen your kind before. Damaged, dangerous, loyal only to the ghosts they carry." He reached out and touched a small, jagged white scar just above her collarbone, a souvenir from a car crash 10 years ago. The crash that was supposed to look like an accident. The crash that killed her mother and forced Elena to become Ellie. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his thumb tracing the raised skin. Ellie trembled. The touch was electric, violating, and confusingly gentle all at once. She wanted to slap his hand away. She wanted to lean into it. "A car accident," she whispered truthfully. When I was 14. Lorenzo stared into her stormy grey eyes, searching for something deep inside her. An accident, he repeated skeptically. Yes. Strange, Lorenzo murmured, his eyes shifting away from hers, looking over her shoulder at something on the wall. That scar, the way it jagged, it looks exactly like the work of a specific man I used to know. A very bad man who worked for the Giordano family. They called him the Ghost because he could get into any house, do his terrible work, and leave without a trace. Ellie stopped breathing. The room spun. He had a daughter, Lorenzo continued, his voice devoid of emotion now, his eyes coming back to focus sharply on hers. Did you know that? A daughter about your age. Both she and her mother disappeared after the Ghost was retired by my father. Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. He knew. He had to know. Lorenzo leaned in, his lips inches from her ear. Tell me, Elena, do you believe in ghosts? Before she could answer, before she could confess or run or scream, a massive explosion rocked the estate. The windows of the music room shattered inward in a shower of glass. The ground shook violently, throwing Ellie to the floor. Alarms blared instantly, a deafening cacophony of sirens. Lorenzo was on top of her in a second, shielding her body with his own, as debris rained down around them. He pulled her up, his face smeared with dust, his eyes wild with a different kind of fire now, the fire of combat. Stay close to me, he roared over the sound of the alarms. He grabbed the silver 1911 from the open case, racking the slide. What is it? Ellie screamed. What's happening? Lorenzo looked toward the window, where plumes of black smoke were rising from the direction of the garage. That, Lorenzo snarled, was a declaration of war. He looked down at her, his expression grim. It seems, my dear liar, that your past has finally caught up with my present. The hallway was a tunnel of smoke and chaos. Lorenzo moved like a shadow, his silver 1911 raised, with Ellie sprinting barefoot behind him. They breached the perimeter, Lorenzo growled, pressing his back against the wall. This is a kill squad. They aren't here to negotiate. We need the panic room in the cellar, Lorenzo commanded. They rounded the corner toward the servants' stairwell, but a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Marco. Lorenzo lowered his weapon slightly. Marco, report! Marco didn't answer. He leveled a submachine gun directly at Lorenzo's chest. Sorry, boss. The Giordanos offered me the future. You're just history. Time froze. Lorenzo was caught off guard. Marco's finger tightened on the trigger. Bang! Marco's eyes went wide as a red flower bloomed in the center of his forehead. He crumpled to the floor. Lorenzo whipped his head around. Ellie stood 5 feet away, a smoking silver 1911, the second one from the display case, gripped firmly in her hands. Her stance was perfect. She hadn't flinched. You really didn't like that apron, did you? Lorenzo murmured, stunned. He was going to kill you, Ellie said flatly. We can't go down. The cellar is a trap. Then we go up, Lorenzo said, accepting the shift in dynamic. She wasn't a liability. She was a partner. To the library, reinforced walls. They moved as a team, suppressing 2 mercenaries on the way, their movements terrifyingly synchronized. They breached the library and barricaded the heavy oak doors just as bullets began to chew through the wood. We have 2 minutes, Lorenzo said, breathing hard in the dark room. He looked at Ellie, soot-stained, armed, and lethal. The Ghost. Ellie froze. That was your father's alias, Lorenzo said, his eyes piercing. Arthur Vance. The hitman my father allegedly killed. That's who taught you to shoot. He didn't kill him, Ellie confessed, the truth spilling out with the adrenaline. He paralyzed him. My father is hiding in a care home in Ohio. I became a waitress to pay for his meds and stay off the grid. Why attack tonight? Ellie pulled the cheap silver locket from her blouse. Because my father stole the Giordano ledger before he ran. The digital keys to their offshore accounts. Billions of dollars. They tracked me here. Lorenzo looked at the locket. It wasn't jewelry. It was a nuclear bomb for the underworld. I give you the codes, Ellie said fiercely. You destroy the Giordanos. In exchange, you get me and my father out. New identities. The library doors groaned as a battering ram slammed into them. Boom. Lorenzo looked at the door, then back at Ellie. He reached out and took her hand. No, he said. No. I don't want the money, Lorenzo said, his voice rough. And I don't want you to leave. We don't run, Elena. We finish it. He pulled her closer, his eyes burning into hers. Ready? Ellie gripped her gun, looking at the man standing between her and death. Ready! The doors exploded inward. The library doors shattered inward, wood splintering like shrapnel. 3 mercenaries stormed the room, expecting cowering victims. Instead, they walked into a slaughterhouse. Lorenzo took the left, Ellie took the right. In seconds, the room was silent, save for the ringing in their ears. The kitchen, Lorenzo shouted, dragging Ellie toward the service maintenance ladder inside the dumbwaiter shaft. Go! They slid down the iron rungs, hitting the cold-tiled floor of the industrial kitchen. They sprinted for the loading bay, but a slow, mocking clap stopped them dead. Bravo! A voice sneered. Victor Giordano stood by the exit, immaculate in a white suit, flanked by 4 rifles. The son of the rival Don had come to finish what his hit squad couldn't. Victor, Lorenzo growled, stepping in front of Ellie. Drop the gun, Lorenzo, Victor smiled, signaling his men. Or I turn the girl into a colander. I hear she's the one holding the keys to my family's accounts. Lorenzo hesitated, looking at the 4 barrels aimed at them. He had no angle. Slowly, he placed his silver 1911 on the floor and kicked it away. Smart, Victor said. He stepped forward, greed lighting up his eyes. Give me the locket, Elena. Now. Ellie walked forward, unclasping the silver chain. She swung it from her fingers, her face unreadable. You want what's inside? I want everything your father stole, Victor spat, reaching out. Ellie didn't pull back. She didn't flinch. She simply shouted one word, not in English, but in Russian. Now. She squeezed her eyes shut and dropped the 2 small canisters she'd swiped from the dead mercenary upstairs. Bang! Flash! A blinding white light consumed the room. Lorenzo, understanding the tone if not the word, had shielded his eyes instantly. While Victor and his guards screamed, clawing at their blinded eyes, Lorenzo moved. He grabbed a heavy meat cleaver from the prep table and hurled it, dropping the nearest guard. Ellie was already in motion. She swept Victor's legs, crashing him to the floor. Before he could recover, she pressed the barrel of her ankle-holstered .22 against his temple. Call them off, she screamed. Lorenzo retrieved his gun, executing the remaining threats with ruthless efficiency. Silence returned to the kitchen, heavy with smoke and cordite. Call them off, Ellie repeated, digging the gun into Victor's skin. Terrified, Victor grabbed his radio. Retreat! Stand down! Get out! Lorenzo walked over, crushing the radio under his boot. Get out of my city, Victor. Tell your father that if he comes near us again, Eleanor releases the ledger. You'll be bankrupt by morning. Victor scrambled up, bleeding and humiliated. He looked at the waitress who had brought an empire to its knees, then turned and ran into the night. The adrenaline crashed. Ellie slumped against the counter, her hands shaking. Lorenzo holstered his weapon and knelt beside her, taking her trembling hands in his. Flashbangs? He asked, a mix of shock and awe in his voice. In your pocket? I like to be prepared, she whispered, a tired smile touching her lips. "You're not going to Ohio," Lorenzo said firmly, brushing soot from her cheek. "My father. We'll bring him here. We'll turn the East Wing into the best hospital money can buy. But you aren't leaving." Ellie looked up, searching his eyes. "Why? Do you still need a translator?" Lorenzo leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I need a partner. Someone who knows the language of this life. Someone who doesn't flinch." He kissed her then, deep, desperate, and full of a promise more binding than any blood oath. It tasted of survival and victory. "Besides," he murmured against her lips, "I can't fire you. You know too much." Ellie smiled, clutching the locket that held $1 billion and the hand of the man who ruled the city. "I suppose I'll stay," she whispered, "but I'm expecting a very large tip." Lorenzo smiled, the darkness in his eyes replaced by a new light. "I think we can arrange that." What a ride. I bet Lorenzo never expected that his dinner reservation would end with a flashbang in his own kitchen. Ellie went from serving sparkling water to taking down the entire Giordano crime family in less than 48 hours. Talk about a promotion. It just goes to show you never really know who's pouring your coffee. If you loved this story and want more twists, betrayal, and high-stakes romance, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Ellie should have taken the shot at Victor, or was letting him live to see his empire crumble the better revenge? I'll be reading your answers. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.